Hello there, it's another week in World of Warcraft, and that means another set of major updates and announcements for the War Within beta, and even a couple of controversies. So let's dive right in. Following last week's developer interview, which promised a fresh new look at the proposed Mythic Plus affixes, this week saw the announcement of what I would describe as a root and branch revamp of the Mythic Plus affix system, accompanied by the announcement of a complete new design philosophy for affixes going forward. Both the current Dragonflight affixes and the previous set of proposed affixes for the War Within have been completely removed, with the exception of Fortified and Tyrannical. In their update, Blizzard explained that they want to move away from a one-size-fits-all approach where the same affixes are being applied to both high-level competitive key pushing and the more mainstream of doing Mythic Plus to get gear and fill the weekly vault, with different affix systems applying to those two groups. For lower keys, the goal is to provide week-to-week variation in feel by providing both positive and negative effects, while providing more challenge but also more consistency for higher level gear pushers. The big headline is the reduction of the number of mechanical affixes in any key from 2 down to 1. Starting at Mythic Plus 2, new Xalatas themed affixes will be applied to the dungeon. This week Blizzard unveiled the first 2 of these affixes. Xalatas Bargain Ascendant causes about 20ish energy orbs to spawn every minute or so. These orbs are similar to the orbs that you might have seen in the Razageth fight and are immune to damage but can be banished by using any type of CC or interrupt. Banishing the orbs grants a stacking 1% haste and movement speed buff for all players in the group. Miss the orbs and enemies in the vicinity will get a 20% movement and haste buff. Now, in my view, having 20ish nameplates spawn every minute or so and requiring a ton of stops or interrupts feels like it could be very overwhelming for players who do keys, especially down at the +2 levels. While AoE stops can deal with these very effectively, many such abilities, such as my Paladin's Blind for example, have longer than 1 minute cooldowns, which means that we would require more coordination within groups than is the norm for low or even mainstream keys. Overall, this affix feels more like it's targeted at the strengths and weaknesses of higher level organised groups than for mainstream friend or pug groups, and I personally don't think that this affix meets the dev's stated goal of targeting affixes towards low or mainstream players. Now, there is scope for Blizzard to tune this down a lot. For example, halving the number of orbs and greatly increasing the gap between spawns could make this a lot more manageable. Another alternative would be to significantly reduce the penalty for failure, giving us a 1% haste buff, but enemies 20% haste per stack seems a bit one-sided. Missing 1 or 2 orbs won't be too bad, but miss even half of them and your tank and healer is going to have a very hard time. The other affix, Xalatas Bargain Frenzied, is much simpler. At 30% remaining health, enemies get a 40% haste increase but also a 20% damage taken debuff. In my view, the difficulty gap between these two affixes is extreme, and for the target audience, Frenzied is pretty much just going to be ignored entirely, whereas Ascendant is likely to be a miserable experience for many. In my view, the difficulty gap between these two affixes is too large for the target audience. Frenzied is pretty much just going to be ignored entirely, whereas Ascendance is likely to prove quite challenging. While it will achieve the developer's goal of making different weeks feel different, achieving that by making one of the weeks much harder than the other really doesn't seem to me to be a good way to go about it. I don't think that this is what the developers intend, but for mainstream and lower level players, I do think that the current version will not provide a good experience in Mythic Plus. Now, Blizzard have implied that there may be more affixes to be added to this bucket before the season goes live, so it probably won't just be a 2-week rotation between these two, and given how receptive Blizzard have been for feedback, I am very hopeful that Blizzard will realise the error and either retune these affixes quite a bit or perhaps substitute some other options in. Fortified and Tyrannical now come in as a weekly rotation at Mythic Plus 4. The There's really not much to see here. It's the same old really. Now, in my view, at lower level keys, the impacts of Tyrannical and Fortified aren't really very noticeable. Even up at +8 or +9 keys, the difference between a Tyrannical boss and a Fortified one, for example, is smaller than the difference I often experience between different pug groups. I don't really think these affixes add very much to lower level play, but then they don't really detract from it either, so it's very much my reaction is kinda meh. At level 7 we get a new permanent affix, Challenger's Peril. This increases the penalty for a death in Mythic Plus from 5 seconds to 15. Now this doesn't sound bad in isolation, but it means that a full wipe will remove over 1 minute from a key's timer. In my opinion, this will likely result in a marked increase in players and pugs quitting potentially viable keys, something that is already a major issue in the +7 to +12 key range, and will only serve to increase toxicity in those mainstream keys. While there are just simply bad people on the internet, a lot of toxicity in games comes down to people venting their frustration, and game systems that increase frustration just make the experience worse for everyone. Toxicity in games is not just a social problem, it's very often a game design problem, and this affix is an example of this in action. Now, in practice, other than more people quitting keys, I don't really think this affix is actually going to have any impact in practice. But that does mean that I think the downsides in terms of toxicity are not sufficiently offset by any benefits, and I really do hope that this is something the developers take another look at. But what about that consistency for higher level play? Well, this starts to come in at level 10, where both Tyrannical and Fortified will be permanently active. Again, there's really not much to say here. It's basically just a step change up in difficulty, kicking in at a +10. Finally, at +12, and the +2 affixes I mentioned get removed and get replaced by a new affix, Xalata's Guile. This is a simple 20% health and damage buff. Most likely, this will be more than enough to offset any loss of difficulty from removing the +2 affixes. So again, there's really not much to say on it. Now, Blizzard have said that they are currently still working out how to change the Mythic Plus scoring system to take account of these changes. Obviously, it will have to change because having separate scores for Fortified and Tyrannical at all levels no longer makes sense. We also don't yet know how gearing's going to work in the War Within. For example, with a +12 seemingly being Blizzard's threshold between high-end key pushing and more mainstream play, how will that figure in when they decide where the best gear drops from? All we've seen so far is some data mining that suggests aspect crests will now drop at +9 and above, so there are definitely still, I suspect, some noticeable changes for Mythic Plus waiting in the wings. Speaking as someone who mostly does Mythic Plus in the +8 to +10 range in a mixture of friend and pug groups, overall I do think that Blizzard's design goals and rationale make a lot of sense, but the Ascendant affix seems to me to be more suited to higher end play in organised groups, rather than the mainstream pug and lower end friend groups who will be playing it, and it's a very strange choice to include. Don't get me wrong, I do think that this is still an improvement over the Dragonflight affix system and EV's the previous proposals, but the +2 affixes clearly could benefit with more work in balancing them out and in better targeting them at their intended audience. Hopefully Blizzard will continue to follow and act upon the feedback from the player base, especially the parts of the player base who will actually be playing the new affixes. If you'd like to give Blizzard your thoughts on this, the World of Warcraft forums are by far the best place to do so, and there's already quite lengthy discussions underway, as you can probably imagine. As a player of Mythic Plus myself, I am super interested to hear your thoughts about these affixes. Will these make you want to play Mythic Plus more, or even less? Or are you someone who is affected by this, or someone who only ever does higher keys and is kind of glad that you won't have to do them? Let me know in the comments down below. Staying on the subject of potentially controversial changes, and while the new Delves feature has had a death counter limit on difficulty levels 4 and above right from the very start, up until now reaching 0 lives has only been punished by reduced rewards from the Delve. In this week's beta update, the tooltip for the death counter was changed to read, "You and your companion will retreat when there are no revives remaining." I have seen some reports that this means that there is now a hard limit on the number of deaths. While I do agree that this wording heavily implies that there will be a hard limit, I have tested this on the current beta and my findings are that I was still able to continue the delve without any progress being reset or lost even after hitting 0 lives. The only change was that a chest icon in the UI now gets crossed out, which I take to indicate the reduced rewards. It's very hard to say at this stage if the death counter is just bugged or that tooltip is just badly worded, but it is opening up the possibility that Blizzard do plan to switch to having a hard limit. Given previous attempts such as Torghast Tarragrue didn't work out very well at all, going down that route would be a complete failure to learn from past mistakes, and it would also be completely at odds with what Blizzard have been saying in their publicity around delves. This makes me think, or maybe it's just hope at this stage, that this is just a badly worded piece of text or maybe a weird UI bug, but if Blizzard are planning to go down this route, I do hope that they rethink it. If you'd like to find out more about how delves work and more importantly how they feel to play, I'll be releasing a full in-depth preview this coming Monday, so make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss it when it comes out. There was, however, one piece of hopefully unambiguously good news from the beta, which is the first look at the new Pathfinder achievement. If you're not aware, in the War Within we get access to sky riding, which is the new name for dragon riding, within a few minutes of arriving in the new zones, but old style flying, now called steady flight, isn't available at first. As with previous expansions, the Pathfinder achievement will unlock that, but unlike in the past, this achievement is going to be available from day one. Completing the achievement simply requires completing the main Leveling's campaign quest. You don't even need to do side quests, and the exploration achievement for each of the zones. This is probably the simplest version of Pathfinder we've ever seen and is very welcome. Oh, and Steady Flight's maximum speed has also been increased from 310% to 420% everywhere to boot. I do have one question in this requirement though, and that is why? While it is pretty straightforward to get, there are players out there who genuinely struggle with skyriding. Most commonly this is due to motion sickness, but there's also folks with eye and limb disorders who also struggle, and this makes steady flight an essential accessibility feature. This requirement really doesn't have any gameplay value, and it will just serve to frustrate or even alienate a segment of the player base, which, while small, is also one that is often not well served by the gaming industry. In my view, very much seems to be the case of outdated design dogma triumphing over common sense. This Monday sees the start of July, and with a new month comes a new trading post, and Blizzard have released the regular preview of what's coming up. This month's reward for filling the trading post bar is another pet, a naga called Trishy. The post itself includes a diving suit transmog for 800 tendies and a fish mount for 800. Now Blizzard did call out in their publicity that this is a steady flight only mount, meaning it won't gain access to skyriding in the War Within. At first glance this seems a bit of an odd choice, but this could actually be a very useful mount, and I have a bit of a hot tip for all of you. In the War Within, the vast majority of flying mounts will become skyriding mounts. Now there is an option to switch between skyriding and steady flight, but this switch has a 5-second cast timer, meaning it can be a bit inconvenient to use. If, like me, you value being able to quickly switch between skyriding and steady flight, having a steady flight only mount to put in your action bars could be super useful. So if you don't already have the Autok mount from the 500 mounts achievement, which believe it or not is now the only other steady flight only mount, this could be a great option. There's also some really good news for former World of Warcraft players in China. Earlier this year, it was announced that WoW would be returning to China this summer, and we now have some firm dates. Wrath of the Lich King Classic, and no, that isn't a mistake on my part, is launching on June the 27th and will be progressing at a significantly accelerated rate, eventually carrying on to Cataclysm Classic at a later date. The modern retail game is returning on August the 1st with the War Within pre-patch, with the full expansion launching on August the 26th. Players will be getting a bunch of bonuses to compensate for almost 2 years of shutdown, including a free play period for Classic and 500 extra traders tender a month for 12 months, along with a big XP buff for levels 60 to 70 in Dragonflight. Mop Remix will not be available in China, but they did announce a plan to bring Plunderstorm to China at a later date. I for one am overjoyed to see the game being restored to former players, and I look forward to welcoming them back. NetEase, who run the game in China for Blizzard, have also announced a prize for 1 million yuan, roughly $137,000, for any Chinese group that wins the global race to World's First. If the winner is from outside China, then the prize will simply roll over to the next season, increasing by 200 yuan each time. It is worth emphasizing that this isn't coming from Blizzard, but it's going to be interesting to see how Liquid and Echo respond to being in a race where one group of competitors has the incentive of a prize that they don't share. Well, that's all the big news for this week. If you found this week's video interesting or informative, please be sure to let me and the YouTube algorithm know by hitting that like icon. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon. That way you'll be notified whenever a new video goes live from me. I have a bunch of War Within feature previews and guides coming up in the next few weeks that I'm sure you won't want to miss out on. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.